We're going to be hearing in turn from our 4 sponsors of the survey. They're going to say a few words each, and then we'll be hearing about some of the findings of the survey. So that will be 4 presentations outlining the results. The printed copies of those reports are on your seats, and they can also be found online at the website at the bottom of this slide. Crucially, the speakers will not be taking questions at the end of each presentation. So if you have questions, jot them down, hang on to them. We'll do them all at the end. So I will share a kind of Q&A right at the end of the whole thing, and that's where you can launch your excellent laid out questions. Before we go on, I thought I'd say a quick word about why I'm here and why I'm interested. So I write about employment at the FT. I have done for at least a decade now. And one of the frustrations sometimes with writing about the world of work is that a lot of our metrics are very quantitative. Everything the ONS gives us is about how many people have a job, how many people work part-time, how many people don't have a job, if they can do that, asterisk at the moment. But what you don't get from that is any of the kind of really fascinating questions that are also super important, not just for policymakers, but also for academics, for journalists, for members of the public, for all of us who are workers. So, yes, people have jobs, but are they exhausted when they get to the end of the day? Do they feel lonely, or do they have a sense of companionship? Are they using these new tools like AI? And if they are, does that make their jobs feel better or worse? These are really important questions. And, over the years, I found that this survey is just a brilliant resource for journalists because it tackles those qualitative things, but it does it in a rigorous way. So I'm a big fan of the survey. I've had several front page stories out of it over the years, and I'm hoping I'll get a few more before too long. So with that, I'm going to leave the floor, and I'll invite Alison to come and say a few words on behalf of the ESRC.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, and a warm welcome from me as well. So I was really delighted to be asked to speak here today because I think the Skills and Employment Survey is a really fantastic example of why ESRC funds a number of high quality social studies. These act as foundational pillars that underpin UK social science, and they're an integral part of our mission to ensure that high quality data can be used to address some of the most pressing challenges faced in the UK at the moment, and also help us advance the UK's reputation for excellent social science research. The topics that you're going to be hearing about later on that were covered by the survey are vital ones that affect key aspects of our working lives. Sarah's given some really good examples now. I also feel that the study really exemplifies why surveys are necessary and why surveys can give us insight into our contemporary world and how it's changing in a way that other sources of data can't. So, for example, the more administrative statistics that Sarah was mentioning. And that's very much a kind of key reason why ESRC invests so heavily in these vital resources. In addition to the evidence that you're going to be hearing about today, the data sets generated as part of the survey will be added to our portfolio of data collections by the UK Data Service, and that creates a really rich library of evidence and data that's available to researchers all over the world, whether they work within academia, whether they're working within, or indeed within the third sector and commercial organisations. I'm really pleased to be here with 2 of the other 3 funders who supported the survey along with us, the Department for Education, ACAS, and the Northern Ireland Executive. And as a funder, I mention that because I think it's really important that we have that collaboration with many of the people we hope are going to be gaining insight from the data that's being collected. The findings covered today have really important implications for policy and for employers, raising key questions about skills, about AI, and about how our working life is organised in the UK. We really hope these findings will inform future policy discussions, they'll inform the discourse by a fantastic journalist like Sarah, as well as generating further research. And on that note, I will hand it over to Christopher. Over to you, Chris.
Hi everyone, yeah, it's great to be here today where we get to explore the findings from the Skills and Employment Survey. So my name's Chris, I'm a Principal Research Officer, Technical Education at the Department for Education, and our division, which is called Skills Policy Analysis, conducts research across a range of further education programs, including apprenticeships, T-levels, skills boot camps, and there seem to be technical excellence colleges, just to name a few. And we also manage a number of our own large-scale surveys that help to ensure our policy decisions are grounded in robust evidence. So I was here at the first launch event. I'd just like to congratulate the research team again for delivering yet another high-quality survey. I've already had a sneak peek at the slides, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, particularly since the topics address various policy challenges we're grappling with in government at the moment. In particular, today's sessions are directly aligned with the department's skills agenda, particularly in addressing qualification needs and inequalities. And just as an example, the findings highlight a significant rise in the demand for graduate level qualifications, with nearly half of workers now needing a degree for their roles. And just this emphasizes the importance of investment in higher and further education, apprenticeships, technical training to ensure we meet the needs of employers. Now, in my area of work, this survey complements our own employer skills survey. So just to make it confusing, ESS, and that recently has highlighted ongoing challenges such as record high number of job vacancies in the economy that are due to skill shortages. So where the ESS captures the perspectives of employers, and the skills and employment survey helps us understand how employees are experiencing these changes, particularly in terms of training, career progression, and job quality. And for instance, the SES reveals that trends with regards to employee participation in training are heading in a positive direction. Yet, in our own research with employers, we see that employers are spending less and less on upskilling their workforces. So there's clearly something to understand there, and some work still to be done. So hopefully that just gives you a flavour of how both these studies complement each other, how we plan to use the research, and how they together can provide a comprehensive view of the skills landscape. So yeah, finally, thank you all once again for your involvement in this essential work. I really look forward to seeing how we can use these insights to drive well evidenced and impactful policies. Thank you.
Right, hi everybody. So yeah, my name is James Chandler. I'm head of research at ACAS. It's really great to be here and involved in this research. I lead a team of researchers at ACAS who evaluate ACAS's many services. We also produce outward-facing policy research on a range of workplace issues, many of which are covered by this survey. I'm just going to say a few words about the importance of this survey to us. So most of you, hopefully, or at least some of you, will be familiar with ACAS. If not, we're a non-departmental public body, part of the Department of Business and Trade. And we're committed to promoting fair, healthy and productive workplaces through a mixture of services aimed at preventing, managing and resolving conflict. And I think it's fair to say the Skills and Employment Survey is unparalleled in its breadth and depth. It serves as a unique, nationally representative data source and is a crucial part of the social science data resource infrastructure. And crucially, it provides valuable insights into key workplace issues such as workplace abuse and union dynamics, which directly inform ACAS's mission to improve workplace relations, resolve disputes, promote fair, respectful and productive work environment. By funding this instalment of this survey, we're demonstrating our commitment to ensuring that our services advice are informed by the latest evidence and involving needs of the workforce. Some of the research here chimes with some of the previous research that we've done, for example, on annual cost of conflict to UK organisations, which is estimated at 30 billion annually. And it's therefore great concern highlighted by this survey that as many as 14% of UK workers have reported experiencing some form of workplace abuse in the year leading up to the survey. Even more so, given that there's been an upward trend since the survey was first conducted in 2014. And this finding tallies with data from our services, with our early conciliation service experiencing unprecedented demand, and our helpline service also dealing with increasingly difficult call topics. Another notable finding from the survey is that the perceived influence of trade unions has increased, with more workers recognising their role in shaping workplace conditions, and the reported growing demand for union representation, especially younger workers. And we've also found similar evidence with growing numbers of indie unions, smaller grassroots unions that differ from the more traditional forms of organisation. So overall, the survey reveals both encouraging and some concerning trends, There is evidence of positive but limited progress towards gender equality and narrowing the gender wage gap. There's increased demand for union representation, and it's notable that the majority of employees consider their work meaningful. At the same time, however, we have seen a decline in employee task discretion alongside a rise in reports of workplace abuse. The survey's findings highlight the scale of the challenge and will play an important role in forming ACAS's new strategy and research and policy programme going forward, and we're delighted to have been involved. Thank you. I'll now hand over. Are they online? Okay.
Hello again. You may have noticed I am not Glenn Parker. Yet. Please pretend I am indeed the principal economist for the Department of Economy in Northern Ireland. He can't be here, so I'm going to read his statement for him, if that's okay. So, Glenn would have said if he was here that the department is delighted to be part of this historic and long-standing research project. And we would like to thank Alan and the wider research team for enabling Northern Ireland to participate in this important piece of research. The project's a crucial piece of work for our department, and it will be used as part of the evidence base to inform and influence skills and employment policy in Northern Ireland. Over the last year, the Department for the Economy has undergone significant change, and we are absolutely clear that growth and prosperity for all will be attained only through a sustained, prioritised focus on skills. The results from the survey will provide us with an invaluable insight to the skills and employment issues that we face and need to address. Our department launched our new economic vision in 2024, which sought to deliver good jobs, rebalance our economy, increase productivity, and reduce our carbon emissions. The findings from this research touches on many of those themes within our economic vision and will be particularly essential in helping us to achieve our good jobs vision. We're looking forward to hearing how the findings can assist us in addressing our employment challenges, developing the required skills for the workplace, and helping us to deliver the economic vision. Given the increasing prominence of artificial intelligence, we're particularly interested in hearing about the findings in this area and how this technology has the potential to reshape how we work, learn, and interact. Our Minister has stressed that it's important that workers have a job that provides a level of autonomy, a decent income, security of tenure, is satisfying, and provides decent working conditions. The findings from the survey will provide a strong basis for helping us to achieve these goals. We're looking forward to hearing about the results and the in-depth analysis and what we can learn from other regions as we seek to address the employment and skills issues facing the Northern Ireland labour market and the wider economy. So thank you, Jeff. And we are now going to hand over to Ying for the first research presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Ying Zhou. I'm a professor of human resource management and director of the Future of Work Research Centre at University of Surrey. Today, I'm going to give you a broad overview of UK Skills and Employment Survey. First, let's take a moment to see how things have changed over the last 40 years. We have all got older, of course, but the world around us has also changed. In 1986, the M25 was opened, and Maradona scored a goal with his hand. In 2006, Google acquired YouTube, and Apple's first version of iPhone was launched. In 2017, a fire broke out in Grenfell Tower, and Donald Trump became the 45th US president. In 2024, the Labour Party was elected to government, the Olympics were held in Paris, and Donald Trump became US president again. So the UK Skills Employment Survey was carried out at these time points. It allows us to examine how the world of work has changed almost in 40 years' time. It's a unique survey series. It's an invaluable resource for the research and policy communities. The 2024 UK Skills Employment Survey is the latest one in the series. It covers employees and self-employed workers in Britain and Northern Ireland. In each survey, people will ask detailed questions about their work. For example, they will ask what skills they use at work, how much job autonomy they enjoy, their level of work intensity, job insecurity, and so on. Similar methods of data collection was used at each survey point, and many questions remain the same. Because of this consistency, we are able to track how things change over time. For example, we can look at how the labor market has changed after the COVID-19 pandemic, with robust before and after comparisons. Why is the survey important? Because it's a critical part of a data infrastructure. Over 230 publications have been published based on this data set. Over 1,000 users have downloaded the data, with 120 from policymaking communities. It's open source data. You can download it from UK Data Service. The latest data will be made available in spring 2026. You can download the combined dataset that includes the entire series from 1986 to 2024, together with detailed documentation. Today, we are going to present some of the highlight findings, but the data is extremely rich. You can answer a lot of interesting questions with this dataset. It's truly a goldmine. Here, I'm giving you a few examples of previous research based on the UK Skills Employment Survey. For instance, the survey reviewed evidence of long-term decline in employee task discretion alongside rising work intensity. Since 1992, job autonomy has declined steadily in Britain. Employees have less and less control over how they perform their job tasks, and they also have less influence over wider organizational issues. At the same time, work intensity increased. For a large part of the past 3 decades, we have seen growing number of people saying they work at high speed, often face tight deadlines, and work under a great deal of tension. The combination of low control and high intensity is particularly problematic because that produces what researchers call high-strain jobs. There's a lot of evidence high-strain jobs are associated with heart disease. Another example is that the skill survey shows a lot of employees experience significant job status insecurity. There's much research on job insecurity, but much less discussion about job status insecurity. People not only fear losing their jobs, they also fear losing valued features of their work. For example, the 2017 Skills Employment Survey estimated 1.7 million individuals were very anxious about unexpected change in working hours. Sudden change in work schedule is tough for people to cope with because it disrupts family life and caregiving. People can't plan their lives. That causes a lot of anxiety. The government's employment bill has proposals designed to tackle this issue by giving workers greater certainty over their hours of work. The Skills Employment Survey also facilitates the development of a new index of graduate jobs. In the past, researchers often use occupation as a proxy of graduate jobs, but it's a rough proxy because there's a lot of heterogeneity within occupations, and occupations can change over time. For example, some occupations may not be considered as graduate jobs in the past, and now they require higher level skills and become graduate jobs. The Skills Employment Survey not only collects information on occupational title, they also ask detailed questions about the job tasks people perform in their work and what skills they need to handle those tasks. So this index is more nuanced than occupation. It also allows us to examine how occupations evolve over time. This task-based index has informed the revision of standard occupational classification in 2020. The final example is the assessment of the importance of job quality for well-being relative to other factors like marriage and health. The Skills Employment Survey shows job quality has a very large impact on our life satisfaction. The size of the effect of job quality is greater than that of marital status, number of children, household income, or what industry or occupation you work in. The only factor it cannot beat is health. Health has a very large impact on our well-being, but the effect of job quality is quite close to that of health. Both emerge as top determinants of our well-being and happiness. The skills survey is not only useful for answering interesting research questions, it's also useful for policymakers. For example, It has been used by the NHS peer review body to justify its recommendations. The SES evidence recently is feeding into Deputy Prime Minister's response to OBR's concerns about the employment bill. A short version of the skill survey has been developed into a quiz. The quiz is called How Good Is My Job? It has been taken by over 150,000 people, and the data has been used by trade unions to recruit new members and by employers to reflect on their employment practices. Throughout the history of the Skills Employment Survey, there has been strong support in the policy community for its continuation. For example, when we were seeking funding for the latest Skills Survey, the House of Commons Department for Work and Pension Committee recommended the government to fund the next Skills Survey because it's a valuable source of data about people's experience of their workplace. To give you some idea of the kind of research produced from the data set, there's a flyer in our pack that profiles 6 research papers produced by the research team. However, there are a lot more papers than that. You can scan that QR code to get a full list of publications based on this data set, or you can click on the link to get the list. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the latest skill survey in 2024. Traditionally, the survey has been based on face-to-face interviews. These interviews take place at people's home. They last about an hour, and respondents were selected based on random probability principles. In 2024, we continued with this approach to maintain consistency with previous data points. In total, we achieved 2,824 face-to-face interviews. On top of that, we also carried out the survey online, and we achieved 2,645 online responses. That covers both Britain and Northern Ireland. So if we take face-to-face and online samples together, the 2024 Skills Employment Survey covers over 5,500 workers across the UK. It makes it the second largest survey in the series. In each survey, we retire about 10% of the old questions in order to make room for new questions, to address new research interests and emerging policy concerns. This time, we added new questions on artificial intelligence technologies. We added questions on the meaningfulness of work, and we also asked more questions about remote working. The location of work has always been covered in the UK Skills Employment Survey, but because of its rapid spread after the COVID-19 pandemic, we added more questions about remote working to get a more detailed understanding of how that affects our working lives. If you want to find out more about the Skills Survey, please consult the technical report produced by NetSun. In addition to the technical report, NetSun also produced a mode analysis report, which looked at whether the mode of the survey influences people's response to different survey questions. They did a detailed comparison of face-to-face survey and online survey. This analysis will inform the decisions about the survey going forward. Who is in the research team? This is a multi-institutional collaboration. It includes academics from Cardiff University, Wizard, Oxford, UCL, and Surrey University. You will have met everyone at these 2 launch events. NetSun deserves special mention because they were responsible for collecting data. Martin Wood, Sarah Butt, and Curtis Jessup led the face-to-face and online data collection teams. Special thanks to them and to the interviewers who carried out the survey. We also thank the thousands of anonymous respondents who took part. Without them, we have nothing to say today. The survey is funded by ESRC, Department for Education, ACAS, and Department for the Economy, Northern Ireland. We have heard from the funders at the beginning. We'd like to thank them again for their support. Our first launch event was held here on the 2nd of April, and these are the topics we have covered. How common is workplace abuse? What is happening to participation at work? Has the tide turned for trade unions? And what makes work meaningful? Some of you were here for the first launch. I hope you enjoyed it. Today, we are going to present 4 additional reports. Are skills requirements on the rise? What drives AI and robot adoption? Is the job quality gender gap narrowing? And is the office dying? You can download all reports from the project website, and you also have hard copies in your delegate packs. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rhys on skill requirements.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Rhys Davies. I'm based at Wizard at Cardiff University. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to join the Skills and Employment Survey research team for the analysis of the 2024 data. I'm going to be talking about a short report this afternoon. Are skill requirements still rising? We know that skills are very, very important in terms of the UK becoming a high-wage, high-growth economy. And as Ying has already detailed, the Skills and Employment Survey, while the clue is in the title, it does what it says on the tin. It contains a huge range of information on skills, education, training, skills mismatch. So I'm going to take you this afternoon on a whistle-stop tour of the data that's contained in those surveys and how it can provide information in those areas. So mine's a very much kind of a headline level analysis, and later on you'll hear Francis, Golo, and Alan go into some particular areas in more detail. So a whistle-stop broad tour on how the Skills and Employment Survey contributes to our understanding of the levels of skills in the UK economy today. So we know skills are important to supporting economic growth and the development of the UK as a high-wage economy. Skills feature prominently in policy discussions. This is from the government's consultation document on the new industrial strategy, so that was launched last year. Skilled workers are more productive, drive innovation, facilitate the adoption of new technology, ultimately boosting growth. If I prepared my slides this weekend, I could have copied and pasted very similar sentences from the immigration white paper that was launched last week. For example, it says, underinvestment in training in the UK workforce and developing skills has contributed to poor levels of productivity and has hindered economic growth. So obviously concern there in the immigration white paper from the government that employers have relied upon migrant labour rather than investing in skills within the UK economy themselves. So how do we measure skills? Well, as has been alluded to earlier on, a common way of doing this is to ask about the qualifications that people hold in the labour market. And this is great, this is important. We know that economic outcomes vary by qualification held, but it misses so much. It doesn't tell us to what extent these skills are used. It doesn't tell us about what kind of skills are used at the workplace. It doesn't tell us about how workers are engaged in training and learning on the job. These much richer questions are contained within the Skills and Employment Survey, and they go far beyond those that are typically contained in the, albeit important, government surveys and administrative data sets that are commonly used. So what indicators do we have of skill requirements and development within the Skills and Employment Survey? Well, first of all, let's define skills quickly. The knowledge required by workers to conduct tasks competently and efficiently. I'm sure we could spend an afternoon on defining skills, but let's not do that. So in the Skills and Employment Survey, into the results, like I'll shortly share with you, we split skills up into some categories. We look at broad skills. So these are the skills needed prior to becoming an integrated member of the workforce. So for example, what qualifications do people have on coming into the workplace? And then when they're in the workplace, of course, many skills are required in the days and weeks and months following the appointment of those workers. So we include questions about how long does it take people to become proficient in their jobs? How long does it take people to complete their training? We also look at the issue of generic skills. Now, these are cross-cutting skill demands of jobs that we see across a variety of occupations and in a variety of industrial settings. The Skills Employment Survey, again, goes into great detail on this. It contains over 40 questions about activities related to the skills that people have, questions about physical skills, cognitive skills, and social skills of the workplace. And we combine these responses to those questions into kind of generic skill groupings that you'll recognize, like numerical skills, literacy skills, computing skills. So we'll look at that. Skills development. Well, the Labour Force survey includes questions on workplace training, but we go into it in much more detail. We dig down, take a bottom-up approach. We ask questions about the training activities, specific training activities that people undertake, on-the-job training, off-the-job training, evening classes, training taken on the internet or via correspondence. We take a bottom-up approach to understand the training that people do, and we ask individuals how long they spend on those training activities during the course of the previous 12 months. But of course, training takes place not just through formal or informal activities like I just described, but it also just takes place on the job by looking at people, watching people, listening to your colleagues. So the SES series contains data on those topics also. We also look at the issue of qualifications mismatch. We don't just ask the qualifications that people who responded to our survey hold. We also ask what qualifications would they require if they were to apply for their job today. So we can get a handle upon there. Do people have qualifications that are higher or indeed lower than what are currently required of new applicants to their jobs? So give an idea of qualifications mismatch. But of course, then skills mismatch goes beyond qualifications mismatch. We also ask individuals whether they have the opportunity to use the knowledge and the skills that they possess. So first of all, then, let's have a look at trends in broad skills. And as was mentioned earlier on, the green line, we'll start there first. This is the proportion of people who say that a graduate level qualification would be required if they were to apply for their current job today. And as we see that almost half of people, 46%, say that a graduate level qualification would be required of them if they were to apply for their job today. And this has increased steadily over the last 3 or 4 decades. It was less than 20% in 1986. So there's still a strong growth in demand for graduate level qualifications. But what about people when they get into the workplace? How long does it take them to do their job? If there's been an increase in the demand for graduate qualifications, maybe once they get into their workplace, training time and time spent acquiring skills to do their job so well, perhaps that's decreased. Well, it hasn't on this chart. The red line shows the learning requirements of jobs. How long does it take people to learn their jobs, to do their jobs well after they enter their employment? And we see quite simply, it takes half of people over 6 months to learn to do their job well. And that really hasn't changed. The response to that question hasn't changed in the last 30 or 40 years. It takes half of people over 6 months to learn their jobs well. We also talk about the training requirements of jobs. So when people enter into a job, how long does it take to kind of get fully trained up on the skills required for their new job? And again, we look at those who say the training requirement is longer than 6 months. And again, this is the blue dashed line. It's a little bit more bouncy, but over time, generally, about 1/3 of people say that it takes longer than 6 months for them to meet the training requirements of their jobs. So the growth in demand for graduate occupations is not substituted with the learning that then takes place subsequently when people enter their employment. So what are these generic skills then? These 40 activities contained in the SES that we then group into kind of broader skill groups. Well, let's look at computer use first, because that's clearly an important skill here. And there's been a steady and strong increase in the demand in the number of workers who say that computing skills are either essential or very important in their jobs. And indeed, the 2024 survey tells us that almost 8 out of 10 workers regard computing skills as essential or very important. Digging into these figures also, an overwhelmingly large majority of that 80% are actually saying skills are essential. So it's not just the bulk of saying very important. And that shift has occurred since the last survey, actually. So people are saying computing skills are essential. And this is affecting skills in other areas also. There's been a strong increase in the use of literacy skills in the workplace. We see that now 58% of workers are saying literacy skills are essential or very important. And that increase has been driven primarily by the increase in the proportion of people who say that their job requires them to write short reports, documents, memos, letters, and emails. So clearly, the increase in computer use has also an impact upon literacy skills in the workplace. And that is a finding that is also mirrored by the OECD survey of adult skills. We found a similar increase in between 2013 and 2024. Other skills that are on the rise, well, Management skills, often cited important area, has shown a steady increase over the years, not so much in the last survey, but we do have also an important increase in influencing skills. This is the ability of obviously workers to influence others at the workplace, and that has shown a steady increase over time. So skills that are allied to management skills, but perhaps not making the same kind of strategic decisions about what's going on in the workplace. So many generic skills are on the rise. Some, however, are fallen. I've not put these on this slide. Examples of skills that have fallen are kind of customer service, customer handling skills. People spend less time selling to people, spend less time, less importance associated with advising, hearing, and counselling customers. And maybe that's perhaps due to the rise of AI and the emergence of perhaps more those kind of activities taking place online, and perhaps the emergence of chatbots to help organisations support their customers. There's also been a slight decline in aesthetic skills. Aesthetic skills are skills associated with looking the part and sounding the part. And again, perhaps there's less of a requirement for people to actually deal face to face with customers and clients. Perhaps those things have become less important over time also. Job-related training. The labour force survey since 2017 has registered an increase in workplace training amongst employees, and we find very similar results. Our figures are much higher because we look over a period of 12 months, whereas the labour force survey looks over the period of the previous 4 weeks. But workplace training has increased with almost 80% of respondents saying that received some kind of training in the last 12 months. This has manifested itself in a variety of ways. We see a small increase in the incidence of off-the-job training. What really has driven this increase in training, job-related training, has been the growth in internet training or training by correspondence, where we see that figure has doubled from 10% in 2017, almost to over 20% in 2024. Such training also tends to take place over longer periods of time. So that increase in training has also contributed to our increase in the incidence of training taking place lasting 10 days or longer. Now, there might be a feeling that this kind of training, where the emphasis is put more on the individual, perhaps to do it at home, do it in their time rather than in work's time, that maybe employers have put less of an onus on individuals to undertake this training. But we don't see to be that doesn't seem to be the case. And respondents to the survey are asked, where's the idea for the training come from? And an increasing percentage are actually saying, well, my employer suggested the training that I did in the last 12 months, my employer suggested that I did the training. So it's not the case that employers are stepping back from this training. They are indeed an important impetus to the individuals undertaking that training. In terms of satisfaction with training, we see that in 2024, 40% of people are completely or very satisfied with the training that they've received in the last 12 months. Only 10% of people are dissatisfied with the training that they've received at work over the previous 12 months. Training, as I mentioned earlier on, skill acquisition in the workplace goes far beyond kind of conventional training activities. We learn from others by watching others, talking to others, listening to others at the workplace. And we see an increase here across a variety of measures of learning at work. So we see a steady trend with increase in my job requires that I keep learning new things. That's the thing on the left-hand side there, steady rising trend there. Also, people are saying that they're involved in teaching others in the workplace. My job requires that I help others to learn. That's increased from 27% in 2001 to 37% in 2024. Team working is also an important source of learning at the workplace, learning from others in your team. And we see a steady increase there in the proportion of respondents who say, I'm able to learn new skills through working with a team. And that's not just because team working has increased. And take that into account, we still see an upward trend. So workplaces appear to be becoming increasingly learning-rich environments across a variety of measures contained within the survey. So finally, where are we? Qualifications and skills mismatch. So as I mentioned earlier on, there's been a steady increase in the demand for graduate level qualifications. There's been obviously a large increase in graduates since the expansion of higher education in the early 1990s, and there are concerns that people in the labour market have higher qualifications than they need. And we did see from 1986 up until 2006 and increasing the proportion of people who had higher levels of qualifications that exceeded those currently required for them to get their jobs. And that increased to 39% in 2006. But since that time, the level of qualifications mismatch has shown a steady, albeit slight, downward trend, to the extent that today only 35% of people in the labour market say that they have a qualification that exceeds the level that they would need to get their job today. We also look at skills mismatch within these other questions about, do you have enough opportunity to use your knowledge and skills in the workplace? And we're there, the blue line, looking at the percentage of people who strongly disagree with that statement. That's been declining steadily since 2001. And similarly, how much past experience, skills, abilities can you use in your job? The percentage of people who say very little has been declining steadily since 1992. And these are really important indicators, because Ying's research and her short report demonstrates that these are very, very important predictors for meaningful work. Having the opportunity to use your skills and abilities is important for people feeling that their jobs are meaningful. So these figures seem to be moving in the right direction. So just to conclude, it's been a very broad overview of all the data that's got on these topics in the report. But I think the benefit of this, by bringing it all together this way, is that we see generally a positive picture. Rising trends in skill requirements, more opportunities for learning at work, and falling levels of skills mismatch. Now, last year, the Prime Minister claimed, I think this was in the documentation surrounding the launch of Skills England, that the UK skills system was a mess, fragmented and broken. Now, I'm not pretending that there's not a parallel universe where we have a different skills system where things, of course, could be much better. But in terms of the indicators that we've been able to show you today, it doesn't seem to be the case that our skills system is indeed creaking. And despite more workers holding graduate level occupations, the rate of qualification is declining. And indeed, also last summer as well, it was emphasised the importance of graduates to the UK in developing workers that were going to kind of serve our talent pipeline, and the importance of world-class universities in this. And I suppose an important policy implication there is if there is a strategic importance to our universities in supporting the development of our talent, at the moment our universities are not being able to put in financial footing. The financing of our universities is perhaps less strategic than it should be. Thank you very much.
Right. Wait to the next talk. Good afternoon, everyone. Also very warm welcome from me. I'm Golo Henseke from University College London. In this slot, we'll explore a deceptively simple question: what drives AI and robot adoption at work? All figures come from our brand new survey. And by the end, you know who's ahead, who's lagging, why it matters, and what should be done next. Cast your mind back to the first time you opened a spreadsheet, bought something on eBay, or connected with a long-lost childhood friend on Facebook. Remember that mixture of amazement and perhaps slight panic when you did that. The AI is provoking similar reactions today, but on fast forward. What seemed like a nerdy fantasy less than 3 years ago has become something that has permeated our private and professional lives. From chatbots writing increasingly longer and more sophisticated computer code to robotic arms packing online orders. We are facing what seems like a rapid change in the tools that are at our disposal. The hope is that these new tools generate productivity gains, provide boring task relief, and maybe help us advance sciences. However, there's also a great deal of fear of job loss, fear of opaque decision-making, fear of surveillance, and fear of social manipulation. It is probably safe to say that everyone's organization in this room will either adopt or be shaped by AI in the next 3 to 5 years. So understanding who adopts first offers lessons and warning lights for inequality. Does that resonate with everyone? Perhaps before we dive actually into our numbers, ask a question to you. Let's find out who is ahead right now. So if you can take out your phone and scan this QR code, it takes you to a short quiz. Just a simple question. Does your job involve generative AI? Do you use ChatGPT, in other words?
There's about 30 seconds left.
So should I leave it up for just a couple more seconds? We do that with our students as well. It always takes ages till everyone logs in and gets the QR code. That's right. And let me know when I should be good. Is it good? Everyone's got? Let's see. 58 responses, 63% said yes, using generative. Your job involves using generative AI. Now let's see how this picture compares with the national pictures, with the national picture that we measured with the skills and employment law. It's an impressive number, by the way. Before we dive into the numbers, let me briefly show you what we've asked workers. The top row is our catch-all question about the use of technology. This gives an overall measure of the use of the share of jobs involving embodied, means machines and tools, and disembodied task automating technologies such as algorithms and cloud-based computing. From there, we asked more specific questions about specific technologies. The second question is our robot question. And basically any automated machinery doing complex physical tasks. We purposely kept this broad. So forklift drivers, packaging line staff, or surgeons could all say yes to that one. The bottom row is our AI question. So basically around software that has artificial intelligence. We left the definition of AI open, trusting that the term is sufficiently well understood. For most people, this will have signal chatbots, but people might have also considered recommendation engines, writing assistants, AI transcription software, and so on. So why does this matter? Why should we look at these questions before we look at the numbers? Firstly, we just asked yes or no questions. So it was a relatively simple question. And we saw in the data that there were very few people who couldn't answer these questions. We think they worked reasonably well in terms of getting people's response at least. Our measures are also deliberately worker-centered. We capture actual exposure, not what an IT manager or supervisor thinks their workers do. Importantly, this means that our AI measure can include private use of, for example, ChatGPT at work. So if someone uses a private account to help them do some work, that's what we captured with this question. The slight caveat with leaving it that open means that our robots probably include some machines that the tech purists wouldn't classify as robots. And the second thing is that AI relies on self-perception. So there will be some measurement error baked into the responses here. Nonetheless, these measures still help us map patterns with sufficient confidence. We've already touched on this. To understand the adoption of the latest technologies, one needs to understand the infrastructure that facilitates its spread and reach. By 2024, 94% of workers use digital devices at work, including computers and automated machinery. If we look specifically at computer use, that would be the top blue line here in this chart. In 1997, only 45% said computers were essential, rising to 78% now. So we're no longer debating whether digital tech is present. The question is which tech and for who. It's a bit like electricity in the 1920s. It's ubiquitous enough that new inventions can be plugged in, like the washing machine back then, or refrigerator that revolutionized completely how housework was carried out. So what did our respondents actually tell us? They told us that a third use at least one task automating technology. A fifth made use of or used AI-enabled software in the job. And about 11% work with robots or automated machinery. This final share is particularly high in manufacturing, where almost 1 in 3 production workers make use of robots. So again, what we call this is just our yes and no questions, aggregated up, counting up how many said yes, basically, to these questions. No measure of intensity here. Nonetheless, adoption is real but uneven. So let's unpick this unevenness in the next few slides. There's a clear pay gradient in AI use. In our data, the top 10% or among the top 10% earners, almost half use AI, whereas in the bottom 10% of the pay distribution, barely 1 in 10 make use of AI. There's also a clear age gradient. AI use peaked among 30 to 39-year-olds and tailing off near typical retirement ages. Moreover, we see gender differences emerging. Men were 6 points ahead of women, which is a gap worth monitoring. And clear differences by industry. Finance and business services led AI adoption, with about a third of workers using AI. Public services, by contrast, were lagging behind, where 15% of workers said we're using AI. So if you picture the typical AI user in our data, you picture a youngish kind of marketing analyst, maybe at a fintech company, using ChatGPT to draft a client proposal. When we look at robots, hotspot is manufacturing, where about 29%, almost 3 out of 10 use robots, work with robots. There's much less gradient, or we actually see no gradient across the pay distribution. In other words, robots replace or augment tasks, but this is not necessarily limited to high or low skill roles. We also see some differences by gender and ethnicity. Men and ethnic minority workers are slightly more likely to operate robots. So maybe an example here could be a logistic warehouse worker, where pallet moving robots follow block QR codes and an operator supervises a couple of them. So robots are very much about the physical workflow, whereas AI spread through its link with knowledge flows. One of the remarkable things that we can observe with our data set, as we collected the skills and employment survey from the autumn 2023 through to the summer of 2024, is the speed with which AI tools have been adopted. Over this period of data collection, the AI user share jumped from 15% to 24%. It's a 9 percentage point change in just 9 months. Compare that with the speed of the 1990s desktop PC rollout, which saw a growth of about 2.5 percentage points per year around the time. It seems that generative AI's consumer grade interface lowers entry barriers. It's not rocket science to type a prompt into ChatGPT. At the same time, it seems to tackle tasks that are relevant to many jobs. And indeed, the low entry barrier for knowledge and expertise have prompted some commentators to argue that AI might help rebuild sort of lower middle class perspective. If allow a thought experiment, given this trend, let's extrapolate what it means. If that pace continued, that's a big if, half the workforce could touch AI tools by early 2026. And that's less than a year away. One of the big questions when we think about technology at work is its relationship with job loss. Does technology augment workers or does it replace workers? We have got, first I talk you through the story. Historically, according to our data, introducing new technologies correlated with layoffs. This correlation peaked in 2017. By 2024, this correlation has almost vanished. So how do we know about this and what is measured here? We asked respondents who stayed with the same employer a few questions about changes in the workplace over typically the last 5 years. So this is our retrospective information. Our respondents are asked to look back over the last 5 years and report on changes in their workplace. This includes changes to the number of people doing the respondent's type of work, and here we specifically focus on workforce reduction and the introduction of new technologies. We correlated these two pieces of information, resulting in the chart in this slide. The taller the bar, the stronger the association of new tech and workforce reduction. So why then this break? What are some explanations for this break after 2070? And there are different explanations, they're not mutually exclusive. For starters, the last years were obviously massive in terms of how work has changed and transformed. Alan is going to talk about remote and hybrid working subsequently. Over this period, it is conceivable that employers use new technologies to foster human-machine collaboration, helping workers work remotely. We have also had a period of skills shortages, so companies and organizations might have found it helpful to augment rather than to replace humans. What this picture also shows is that past patterns are no guarantee for future trends. Some might argue we are in a calm before the substitution storm, and if you follow news of repeated layoffs at tech companies or emerging reports on the state of the graduate job market, one can't help but think that employers might have started to pocket some of the time savings from AI. So we need to maybe want to start a little bit about how can we shape and what shapes AI take up, particularly at the workplace level. It's not just about technology adoption and deployment. It's not just about feasibility, but crucially organizational decision making. We examined some workplace drivers of AI adoption, finding that digital infrastructure matter. Those organizations where a higher share of workers used computers, where the digital infrastructure was in place, these were also the organizations where workers were more likely to use AI. We also saw differences by high performance work practices, so in other words, management quality. Open problem solving culture and continuous improvement cycles might have fostered or led to faster adoption of AI. There's also clear differences by the workplace size. Larger workplaces might find it easier to amortize upfront costs and to hire specialists that integrate these tools into work processes. There are also differences by the intensity of work, where deadlines are brutal. Tools promising 10% speed gains look very attractive. And as I already mentioned, there are differences between private and public sector. Procurement red tape, accountability, security concerns, or limited capital budgets might be some of the explanations for this difference that we see in the data. So given the emergent findings of fast but an uneven AI uptake, we consider a few recommendations. For starters, we think that an deployment fund for lagging sectors, especially health, education, local government, might be a way forward. And some of this is already underway with initiatives such as Bridge AI funded by UKI. We also think that sector roadmaps co-designed with unions and small and medium enterprises might have identified some of the challenges in adopting AI and making it work for all. We also see the need for a greater effort to gather intelligence on this rapid change that we're seeing in the world of work. The real-time dashboard on jobs, AI adoption, wages, and skills demand would be very handy when it comes to making decisions that could affect us all. The ONS already collects information from firms about their use and plans to integrate AI, but this tells us too little about who uses AI and what for. We also think it's worth emphasizing the point that it's important that the workers' voice get heard when it comes to thinking and how AI is going to be deployed in work. For determining committees to vet and inform AI practices might help to support the augmentation function of AI rather than the replacement of work. And finally, efforts to expand AI literacy and reskilling of workers in at-risk jobs, including the lifelong learning entitlement when it then finally gets off the ground, will be interesting to follow and see how this plays out. And that's my question to you as well, and something we might want to discuss in the Q&A, what could be done, should be done to minimize the potential negatives from this new tech. So the key takeaways from my presentation is the digital foundation is there, it's universal. The door is wide open for new tech. AI adoption is exploding, but uptake is unequal. The robots is less about skills and more sector by sector. We have not seen signs yet of a tech-driven job burst, but who knows? The future will tell. Adoption finally is a choice and not a fate. Infrastructure, utility, culture, and policy can tilt the balance towards augmentation. And that brings me to my final thought, really. Technology and its uses are negotiable. We can use it to amplify talent and broaden opportunities, or let it deepen divides and open new ones. So the data show where we are, the next moves are ours. So I thank you all, and I look forward to our discussion.
I think we should give you a few seconds to pause to take all that information in. It's a wonderful new part of our survey, this information on AI and digital technology. So we're very pleased and still exploring it, I think. And there's a long way to go. Okay, so my name is Francis Green, and I'm the Professor of Work and Education Economics at UCL. I work not in the economics department, but in the Institute for Education, or what used to be called the Institute for Education, and for much more complicatedly, the Faculty for Education and Society. That's progress for you. And what I want to talk about today is job quality. That's something I've personally been working on for a long time now, and particularly intensely in the last couple of years. And so I've focused for my talk today and my particular report I've led on job quality. It's a very rapidly growing area in social science, I believe. Hundreds of articles are now being written every year under the general theme of job quality. There used to be only a few every year 20 years ago. Now there are lots. So it's a devil of an area to keep up with, apart from anything else. So my particular focus is going to be on the gender gap as applied to all different dimensions of job quality. It's something which is pretty familiar to you, I'm sure, that there's a gender gap in wages. So yes, there was a declining gender gap in wages, most people know. We know that from perfectly good other data sources on that. After a quarter of a century, say from, here are my figures from the Office for National Statistics, back in 1997, the wage gender gap was given 17%. By 2024, it's down to 7%. So I would describe that as modest progress, modest and steady progress. However, underpinning this talk today is the observation that less is known, much less is known about the extent and generation of gaps in other dimensions of job quality, and indeed how they are changing. So that's going to be what this particular talk is about. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because these other dimensions are just as important as wages as determinants of well-being and health in many different indicators of health. So that's part of this growing literature that I mentioned just now. Many studies are showing, for example, the detrimental impact of long hours working, the detrimental impact of jobs with very little autonomy, the significant impacts, for example, of jobs that are very insecure on people's health and well-being, and for the health and well-being of the workforce. And there's an expanding evidence base of that. It's what was true a couple of years ago is even more true now, because more and more articles are being produced all the time, building up our knowledge as social scientists of the effects of these things, not just social scientists, but also medical scientists as well. So what is it affects job quality? What are the basic factors behind it? Well, job quality is affected by lots of factors, such as economic growth, regulatory environment, which is changing, by technological change, which we've just been hearing about, by the balance of bargaining power between the employees and the employer, just as wages is determined that way. So these other forms of job quality determined in that way. And above all, also by managerial culture. And one of the outcomes of my research has shown that a lot of these different dimensions of job quality that I'm going to talk about are quite separate in a way. They move in different ways. They're not kind of part of one big thing, saying working conditions. They move in different ways. We need to understand how each of them is moving and changing over time. One might expect that just as there's a narrowing gender gap over time, there might also be a narrowing gender gap in just as we've seen it in earnings, we might expect it in these other dimensions as well. But because so many factors are involved, we don't know. So the overarching question of this report and this talk today is, are jobs becoming more or less similar for men in respect of these different dimensions of job quality. So that was a task set for myself today. So what are these other dimensions? Well, we can configure job quality in a number of ways, but here is one way which I've been using for a number of years and others also use. We call rather grandly the job quality framework. And it has got 7 dimensions. Earnings, which is how earnings contribute to meeting our needs. The general notion of job quality is the practice about a job which contribute to meeting our needs as workers. So it's a very worker-centered definition. It's not talking about the quality of the work we do and from the point of view of production. It's talking about the quality of the jobs from the point of view of meeting workers' needs from their jobs. So earnings, yes, that's obvious. The next one is prospects, which at its broadest encompasses both one's job security, job insecurity, but also one's future prospects. Do you have a chance of getting promoted or moving up in your job? In this talk today, to get consistent data over time, I'm just going to focus on job security because we do have good data on prospects of jobs, future promotion prospects and so on, but not sufficiently going back in time, unfortunately, to give a trend. The third dimension is what we call working time quality, which is most generally the extent to which the scheduling and duration and variability of time also contributes to meeting the needs of workers. In particular, though, I'm going to look today at the absence of very long hours, which has been shown to be significantly related to one's health, and employee-controlled flexibility. Also, there are studies out there showing how it's related to health and well-being. Fourthly, there's a dimension called autonomy and skill, which actually, in the name, combines 2 sub-dimensions. Autonomy is task discretion. We've heard a lot about that already in the reports. And job skill, which we just heard about from Rhys. Now, because those 2 concepts are both theoretically and empirically related, I've treated them together into one index. They are indeed, the 2 indices for autonomy and for job skill are indeed related. And to keep things simple and presentable, because I've got a lot of numbers I want to present to you, that's the reason, but I will talk about how those things move independently. Then 6th is the physical environment. I might cover water here, sorry. The physical environment, which is not, to be honest, brilliantly measured by our survey, but we don't have lots of questions that measure exposure to different kinds of workplace hazards, ergonomic disadvantages. But what we do have, and I'll show you in a minute, is one good question, which was asked consistently for a long way about perceptions of the physical risks of work. And then finally, there's a dimension which is called work intensity, which is, broadly speaking, the pace of work, the rate of which tasks and jobs and your workload has to be carried out while you're at work. It's distinct from the length of the working hours. It's the number of jobs you have to do within those working hours. The one dimension which I'm not going to cover today is the social environment, which is to do with the extent of workplace abuse and the extent of managerial support and social or colleague support that you might have. We do have some good measures of that now, but again, only for 2024. We've introduced them recently, but we don't have them going back over time. Okay, so I've dwelled a bit of time describing that setup there. I would say that it's not the single configuration of job quality you could have, and other scholars have preferred other different categorizations, often depending on the data they have. But generally, you'll find most of those dimensions are included in most people's ideas of what they mean by job quality. So let me move quickly to some previous evidence of it, just to give the background story. Well, we do have a lot of evidence about pay and a lot of evidence about the pay gap. But the overall story about other aspects of job quality, the evidence is there, but it's quite sparse. So, for example, we do know from previous publications that the gender gap for working time quality and for the physical environment was in favour of women in 2015 in the United Kingdom. One fact we know, and that mirrors other facts about those dimensions in other parts of Europe. Some of you will know that the European Working Conditions Survey, which has been carried out in Europe every 5 years since the beginning of the 1990s, contains very good questions. And so there is quite a lot of information out there about Europe as a whole, but not a lot of information about the individual countries, for which they usually have about only 1,000 observations per country. So about Europe as a whole, we know that, for example, the gender gap for autonomy and skill is there is a gender gap in favour of men, and have higher levels of autonomy and skill, but then they have lower levels of the physical environment. But these narrowed over the period between 1995 and 2010. So there was some narrowing convergence going on there, at least in those dimensions across the whole of Europe. But there's actually relatively little change in the other dimensions of gender gap. And the evidence from that working conditions survey in Europe does tell us that gender segmentation remains at an alarmingly high level across Europe. So that's the previous evidence. It's a bit sparse. Let me now then move on to the indicators that we have in our Skills and Employment Survey 2024. So for earnings, we're using simply the median weekly earnings of employees and of self-employed. We're confident about the measures, indicators of the employees, less confident about our measures of self-employed because of more greater difficulties of collecting accurate data. Unless we do have some data, and so we include them in. Working time quality, we have two indicators. One is employee control over the start and finishing times of their jobs, and the other is not working over 48 hours per week. This is both now, as you probably know, a threshold for the European Working Conditions, European Working Time Directive, which was recently passed in the 1990s. But it's also a threshold above which many studies of the impact of hours on health have been focused on. So there are a number of studies now which show that long hours produces various health effects. Then there's prospects, which, as I said earlier, is basically, from the point of view of this talk, job security, because that's what we can measure consistently over a long period of time. Essentially, this is the need for a future. It's not just the present. People have not just present needs, but the need for future. We don't have long-term data on promotion possibilities. Fourthly, autonomy and skill. Autonomy is essentially the extent to which people have influence over their own labour process, and the skill is the skill requirement, much of which Rhys already talked about, essentially the required competence to do jobs. Those two indices are comprised of a number of questions. They are empirically related, correlated, and theoretically correlated. So I've combined them into one index for the purposes of this presentation. Fifthly, work intensity is simply a measure of the pace of work, but we pick it up through three questions on the pace of work, pressure of deadlines, and the requirement for hard work, which is integrated into one index. And finally, the physical environment, which, as I mentioned earlier, we don't unfortunately have lots of good questions about exposure to workplace hazards, but we do have a question about the extent to which people feel that their jobs make them physically at risk. And it's a simple question, but it has, as often simplistic, simple questions do have, it has a revealing story to tell. Okay, so the rest of the empirical part of my talk is essentially going to be trying to just give you a picture. And what have I got? I got 6 pictures. No tables, no figures, just 6 pictures to show you of those 6 dimensions for which we do have a story to tell. And we'll start with the working time quality. Remember, the overarching question is, to what extent is there a convergence in job quality between the genders, between men and women? And so what do we learn from this picture here? We learn that, well, working time quality is better for women than men. And essentially what lies behind that is there are many fewer women doing long hours, more than 48 hours per week of paid work, should add. So we're talking about jobs here, not the whole sphere of life. But there's an obvious convergence that can be seen from that gap. What underpins that convergence? Well, actually, both men and women have had a small, modest increase in schedule control over the start finishing times. So it's not. So that's a modest improvement, which is pretty slow over such a long period of time, 2 decades. But what's changed is that there are far fewer men doing over 48 hours per week. So that's an improvement for men. Well, but women were already doing less than 48 hours per week. So that's the source of the convergence there. So yeah, the number of men not working more than 48 hours per week has gone up from 78 to 86% over that period. Second dimension is median weekly earnings. Now, this is not specifically new to our survey here. We can see this in other data sets, although what we've included here is both the employees and the self-employed. We see a slowish convergence. You need to look fairly hard at it to see the convergence going on, but there is a convergence. And it's interesting to see that most of that convergence happens over the course of the period between 2006 and 2012, which of course spans the Great Recession. So what we're learning from that is that the wages of men in particular, and including the self-employed, really collapsed during that period and only slowly recovered, so that by 2024 you'll see that men's earnings in real terms is no different from what it was in 2006. Think about that statement for a moment. It makes Britain unusual. Probably in about across most of the data for which countries for which we have data in the advanced Western world, I would say about 5 out of 6 countries, you will see consistent increases in real wages over a period as long as this. You do not see that particularly for men here. But for women, you see, well, a pretty constancy of pay in the period 2006, 2012, 2017, but ongoing increase through to 2024. So that taken together overall the period, there's been a steady increase, palpable increase. So again, some convergence. Moving on to the next dimension, third dimension, job security. What do we see there? We see that job security is actually fairly similar between men and women. This is a combination of an index of people's perceptions of their probability of losing their job within the next 6 months, on the one hand, and whether they hold a permanent or a time delimited contract, fixed term or temporary contract. So combining those two indices together, we see that, and actually what happens to job security over time can be read from macroeconomic conditions. And you see a slight increase because we've gone as far back as 1986 there. We'll cast back to 1986 when unemployment was about 4 million. I remember about 4 million, absolutely record levels in the early 1980s, just starting to come down. And it was still pretty low in 1992, when there's another recession in that 1991 to 92. So that's reflecting macroeconomic conditions, and you find that in most countries, that people's perceptions of their own insecurity mirrors the trend in the macroeconomic performance. And yeah, you find that in lots of countries. There's no obvious real secular trend there. And similarly, there's no obvious big gap between men and women. Now to the interesting case of autonomy and skill. Now, as I explained before, I combine them into a single index. I'll try and pick that apart in a moment. But what do we see? We see another case of convergence. Convergence, if you like, men from above. It's not necessarily a good story. This is partly picking up on something that Rhys talked about just now. And definitely picking up on something that Duncan Gallie talked about in his report presented in our previous event. So if you compare men and women, on the whole, on average, the levels of autonomy recorded in our survey for men is distinctly above that for women. But the convergence over time has come basically mainly from men's autonomy declining, and a little bit from women's autonomy increasing, at least since 2001. Let me just pick that apart for a moment, because if you average out men and women, you can see that overall, over time, there's not much trend in this indicator of autonomy and skill. But actually that hides the kind of decoupling that's going on, because although theoretically and empirically they're correlated at the individual level, autonomy and skill, the average level across the country of autonomy has been going down. The average level of skill requirements and competence requirements has been going up. It's a remarkable decoupling which seems to be still going on. So it's possible that in future reports I might feel, or we might feel, that it's worthwhile looking at those different trends separately. My job today was to try and encapsulate a large number of trends into as relatively small a number of graphs as possible to make things tractable. Moving on to the fifth dimension, which is, sounds like something out of space, doesn't it? When I thought about fifth dimension. The physical environment is also a remarkable tale of convergence. And even though we have a pretty simple measure, which is people's perception of the risk of physical harm at work, what we see is that, what I'm plotting here is the reverse of that, that the perceived probability that they don't face any physical risks from their workplace. We see that for women, it's the top line in red, it's pretty well stays the same at about just under 80% for the long term. But from 2001 onwards, we see a distinct improvement for men. A distinct improvement for men. And yeah, it's not something which we kind of picked up on in the past, certainly for the first 2 or 3 surveys in this series. It kind of looked much of a muchness, but it's definitely increasing solidly and is now at an same level as for women. So one might want to argue about these perceptions of physical risk and so on, but there seems to be some palpable change here. It's partly to do with the changing industrial structure. I'm sure some of you are thinking about that. Fewer mines around, fewer coal mines around, fewer very risky jobs. Perhaps there are fewer jobs on North Sea oil platforms and so on and so forth. So you'd expect some changing industrial structure to have an effect. But we looked into that, and probably no more than a half can be accounted for in that way. Almost certainly what's lying behind this is some regulatory improvements over time. I'll give you one example of that, would be the ban on smoking in the workplace, which came in, I think, in 2006, about then. And you see that not only in Britain, but across Europe, you see a palpable improvement in terms of decline in exposure to that particular hazard, secondary smoking, for example. On the final dimension then is work intensity, and we see there a story which I have talked about a lot in the past, which is one of work intensification in the British workplace, right up until the 2017 survey, with obviously no clear gap between men and women. So the gender gap story is kind of already converged in a sense. But something happens in 2024. There seems to be, for the first time, an overall de-intensification of work, particularly for males, which is an interesting discovery. It's not the only country where this has been found. So maybe the British workplace reached some kind of limit. Maybe it's the effect of COVID and the spread of home working. We know from some other work we've done that the expansion, particularly what work we've done with Alan and Rhys, using different data, that home working is associated with lower levels of work intensity. So maybe that's part of the story there, but it's at least an interesting thing to note that there's been a de-intensification of work over this period spanning the COVID lockdowns, and as we shall shortly learn, the expansion of home working. Okay, so that's basically taken me through all the different dimensions, and let me just then conclude with some summary and implications. I would like to reiterate to begin with how important these things are for our health and our well-being. Try to suggest to you that this is not just an academic matter, which boring old academics like me rabbit on about for ages. These things really matter and really do affect people's health, mental health, and their physical health. physical health. And Ying suggested briefly earlier on, sometimes more than lots of other spheres of life. There is then a convergence in these things that matter, in earnings, working time quality, the physical environment, and in autonomy and skill. And it seems to be part of the story that perhaps jobs have become less gendered over the long term. Nonetheless, a gender gap, a significant gender gap, we know, remains. One of the things not shown here is that there's a significant gender gap in terms of the social environment, in particular in terms of exposure to workplace abuse, which was the topic of the report that I presented in April. It's clear to me that, at least from one of those diagrams, that it's quite, it can quite easily open up again a gender gap if we don't watch it and monitor it. So my final comment is the need for better monitoring. We don't know enough about what's happening to job quality over time, and we need to monitor it. We need to see the impacts of equality legislations. We need to see the impact of changing company cultures and so on and so forth. And we monitor this rather badly in this country. We don't take part in the European Working Conditions Survey anymore. The Labour Force Survey introduced some questions on the social environment, on some very partial questions on autonomy and skill, on working time quality and prospects. In 2021, they muddied the waters with questions on job satisfaction, which is interesting in itself, but nothing to do, not the same as job quality. And in any case, much of that data is not accessible. We can't get at it. We can't seem to get at it anyway. So my call, I think, today is that we do need to have better monitoring job quality. It's something which is, it's not rocket science to do it. It's a matter of good survey work. Sarah mentioned the value of surveys. I'm absolutely behind that comment that she made earlier. Administrative data is all very well for the future, but it's only through survey work. This is our, if you like, our metaphorical telescope that we can understand the changing workplace. It's only through survey work and parallel with that, the qualitative work, that we can understand the way things are actually changing in modern day workplaces. So that's my plea to you all. Goodbye.
Not going to touch the screen, not going to touch this laptop. Very temperamental, so be very careful, Alan. I keep telling people that, so I must do the same. Hello, my name is Alan Felstead. I'm from the Wales Institute of Social Economic Research and Data, or WIZARD for short, at Cardiff University. In my 20 minutes or so, I'll be addressing the question on this slide here: is the office dying? Or as this graphic suggests, is it simply being relocated into the home? Maybe in a home office, in the lounge, or not shown here in the kitchen. Places of work, such as factories and offices, and homes where people live, have traditionally been physically separate spaces. People went out to work and came back home to rest and recuperate. And this separation has endured since the Industrial Revolution. It is a separation that has influenced many of our taken for granted concepts. So work is done in a workplace. Often people think of a factory or an office, during the working day and throughout the working week. Whereas home life is something which happens within the boundaries of the house or on family outings and takes place in the evenings, at weekends or on holiday. That is times when paid work has been done and workers are off. However, working at home has flourished in some parts of the economy such as clothing and footwear, for centuries. I remember my granddad worked as a clipper at home in the boot and shoe industry. I remember rolls of leather were delivered to his house every week. He took the leather upstairs to his workshop, which was a converted bedroom. He used a variety of sharp knives and patterns to cut out the upper parts of shoes and boots. My mother-in-law too also worked in the boot and shoe trade in Leicester. She was a post machinist. She had a special machine in her living room, a machine on a post, that's the name, post machinist, which she used to sew the soles of shoes onto leather uppers. This type of work continues today, but often in less developed economies. Now, claims were being made over 40 years ago that by the start of the new millennium, that's the year 2000, most work would be carried out in what was called electronic cottages, kind of the images of niceties and kind of the roses round the door and so forth. However, that revolution failed to materialise, at least until the outbreak of coronavirus in early 2020. And one of the principal means of halting the virus was the request, and it was sometimes the insistence, that work was carried out at home if at all possible. This turned on its head the long-standing understanding that work and home are separate spheres of life. However, as I will show using the Skills and Employment Survey data, the spike in working at home during the pandemic is part of a long-term trend which predates those lockdowns. Now, those living and working in the same space have to deal with two issues: the close proximity to the domestic life of the household, and at the same time, their geographical distance from co-workers located elsewhere in the organisation, and of course, their bosses and managers. This is challenging, has to be managed, and it's difficult. It makes working at home conceptually distinct from other work arrangements. Now, evidence suggests that the share of the UK workforce reporting mainly working at home rose overnight from just over 6% to 43% when the lockdown restrictions were suddenly put in place. Almost everybody was working at home if they could. These were, of course, dramatic and unprecedented times. We'll probably never see that again in our lifetime. Now, while some high-profile companies have mandated staff to return to the office post-pandemic, many have sought to capture the best of both worlds by allowing employees to work on a hybrid basis. It remains a hot topic with suggested implications well beyond the world of work. Its continued prevalence has, for example, been linked to, there's a list here, changing commuting patterns. Again, travelling to London on a Monday, you see the difference, just anecdotally. Variations in house prices, declining footfall in primary city centre locations, and the rising popularity of shops, cafes and restaurants close to places of residence. The popularity of golf courses and golf memberships during the working week, and even hosepipe bans in the summer. That was 2 years ago. I'm sure it will come again. We'll have hosepipe bans. We'll have working at home being the culprit of hosepipe bans probably in this summer. Now, a good source of the more frivolous claims is the front page, sorry, Sarah, of the Daily Star. Right? Always worth a good look. Now, sometimes the message, if not the headline, of the Daily Star and the Financial Times do coincide, surprisingly. They do. It did, for example, when deodorant sales fell in the pandemic. Now, the Star's headline, wait for it, was "They think it's all odour." Just reflect on the Maradona hand being talked about. So it was a footballing metaphor. They think it's all odour. The Financial Times front page was a little not of the same ilk. It was deodorant sales have fallen. But they're on the same page, on the same wavelength, but slightly different takes. Now, while the benefits of working at home, such as more autonomy, which has been talked about already, being able to deal with family matters, and of course, avoiding the daily commute to work, there are costs, there are benefits and costs. Those working at home often are connected to work longer and are more likely to email or even attend conference calls outside of working hours. In addition, pressures of work can spill over into non-work life, with home workers reporting difficulties in being able to switch off. This is particularly pronounced when work is carried out in spaces within the home, otherwise used for domestic purposes, such as on the dining room table, in kitchens, or on the corner of a bed in a bedroom. For them, home and work is all around them all the time. Now, fear among employers is that without physical oversight, which they've relied on for centuries, employees will shirk and productivity will fall. However, on balance, home working during and since the pandemic seems to have little effect either way. It's difficult to tell conclusively whether it's a negative or positive. Most studies say it has made little difference. Now, there are surveys which can consistently differentiate between workers according to the extent to which the worlds of work and home overlap. Thankfully, the Skills and Employment Survey is one of these. Since 2001, respondents have been asked the same 2 work location questions, again allowing us to see how things have changed over time. The first asks, in your job, where do you mainly work? Now, there are 5 response options shown on this screen. At home, in the same grounds and buildings as home, so this could be an adjoining property or surrounding land, such as in the garden, for example, in an office, a shoppice, talked about nowadays. In a single workplace away from the home, that's an office, a factory or shop, what we traditionally think of as the workplace. In a variety of different places of work, such as working on clients' premises, in their own homes, clients' premises, clients' homes, and working on the move, that's delivering products or people to different places. Think of bus drivers. The second question asks, in the last 7 days, have you spent at least 1 full working day working anywhere else? So using these 2 questions, we can differentiate the extent to which the world of work and home overlap for workers. We define home workers are those who reported that they worked mainly at home or in the same grounds and buildings as their home, such as the garden, and did not report working anywhere else in the last 7 days. So they work exclusively at home. For them, the worlds of home and work directly overlap. Hybrid workers are defined as those who reported that they work mainly at home or in the same grounds and buildings as their home, but that they also worked in an office, factory, or shop for the last 7 days. So hybrid workers. The third category of workers are those who work either mainly or for at least 1 day a week in a variety of places or work on the move. So we call these mobile workers for obvious reasons, given the availability that's central to their being. Finally, we define fixed place workers as those whose main place of work was a single workplace away from the home and that they reported working nowhere else in the last week. So for them, the worlds of work and home are spatially separate and distinct. Each signifies the degree of work-home overlap. The 2024 survey also included a series of follow-on questions not previously asked in the series. Again, Ying mentioned this in her talk. We retired some questions to make room for new questions. And this is a new question we added. So we asked respondents in what type of space in the home they worked when they worked at home. 4 options were given. Have your own home office, often kitted out with regular office chairs, desks, and so forth. Share your home office with someone else. Have a permanent workstation, but not a home office, the corner of a bed in a bedroom, for example, or working spaces also intended for other uses, kitchen, dining room, table. These different response options indicate the degree to which home and work overlap when work is brought into the home. So recreating spatial separation, a home office, often with looking like an office, It looks like, it feels like an office, it must be an office because it's in the home. It's at one extreme. And working on the kitchen table is at the other. So we've got a kind of spectrum here. This kind of data is extremely rare. And SES makes a distinctive contribution by shedding light on where within the home work is carried out. Now, despite the interest in work location during the pandemic, and there's been a lot, and subsequently there's been a lot. I mean, Francis talked about job quality and the spike of interest in that. My gosh, there's a spike of interest in working at home and hybrid working since the pandemic. Despite that, the shifting location of work was well underway before the pandemic. So look at the black line here. This shows the proportion of workers reporting that they worked in a single workplace, such as an office or factory. For them, the worlds of work and home were spatially separate. This has been declining ever since respondents were first asked about where they worked. In 2001, around 2/3, 64%, worked in fixed places of work, office, factory. In 2017, around half of British workers did so. And by 2024, the proportion has fallen to less than 2/5, its lowest point ever. But the decline predates the pandemic. Why is this? Well, the growth in home working and hybrid working are largely responsible for this shift, as you can see in this graph. Look at the red and blue lines. In 2024, around 1/3 of workers were using their home as a workplace to some degree, with 13% home workers, as I've defined them, and 21% as hybrid workers. How the data show that this shift predates the COVID-19 lockdowns, with a big pickup in hybrid working, for example, before the pandemic, before we all talked about hybrid working. You can see this graph here, the blue line, a big pickup well before the pandemic. However, the pattern of change has been variable. For some groups, it has been dramatic. For others, it's been modest. And for some, it's been barely detectable. Let's start with the middle bars in this chart. These bars show the growth in home working since the pandemic has been particularly pronounced among employees, where its prevalence has almost tripled, compared to the self-employed, where its prevalence has nearly doubled. Both groups, it's been a big increase, but one more than the other. The bars on the right show that home working has rocketed among those in higher skilled jobs, such as managers, designers, and analysts. Dare I say, probably people like yourselves in the room and online. Its prevalence among this group has more than doubled, rising from 7% to 17% in 2024, a big rise. Among intermediate occupations, such as clerks, clerical assistants, bookkeepers, it has also risen, doubling it from 6% to 13% during the same period. However, look at the bars on your right. Among those in lower skilled jobs, there's been little change, little or no change. These are jobs which typify the historic image of home working, which actually I started out researching in the mid-1990s. These include machinists, operators, packers, actually the type of jobs my granddad and mother-in-law did. Let's look at hybrid working. As this graph demonstrates, the shift towards hybrid working has been similarly uneven. For example, the growth in hybrid working since the pandemic has been more pronounced among men, where it has grown from 12% to 22%, a big rise, compared to a 3 percentage point increase among women. Among employees, it has grown from 15% to 22%, compared to a modest 1 percentage point change among the self-employed. Hybrid working has also grown very strongly among higher occupational groups, jumping from 19 to 23%, 29% in 7 years, but it's changed little elsewhere. Although here the numbers are relatively small, so our estimates are imprecise. As I kind of hinted at throughout my talk, little is known about whether those who work at home can spatially separate home and work activities and thereby create a home office of their own. So actually re-import the office into the home. Working at home, working in a home office provides a visible cue to those working at home and others in the household that individuals are shifting between the world of home and work. They're in a mode shift. In my work mode, I'm in my office. A clear transition back and forth can have beneficial consequences for workers' productivity and their mental and physical well-being. Shifting gears. The opposite is true for those who have to work in spaces which are also used for domestic purposes, just as the kitchen or lounge. Very difficult to switch in that particular case when the household is all around you. Things are going on constantly. So moving right to left on this graph, starting with the green bar, our results suggest that around a quarter, 27%, have people work in spaces intended for other purposes, such as the kitchen or the dining room. And a fifth have a workstation in the corner of a room, the blue bar. 6% share an office with another member of the household, that's the black bar, and 45% have a home office of their own, the red bar. However, who has access to these spaces? That's the research question we're asking here, or trying to address. And the answer is the access to these spaces is uneven. This graph shows that home offices are disproportionately occupied by men rather than women. The split is 60-40 in favour of men. The reverse is true for those working in spaces used for other purposes, such as the living room or the kitchen. Here it's 59% of women report working in these spaces compared to 41% of men. However, things are a little more complicated than this, and we hint at this in the report. An extended account of these findings will be the subject of fuller academic paper. Now, as Ying pointed out in her talk, many of the things we did in the face-to-face survey were the same, so we can compare like with like. But one change we did make, which has no difference on the composition of the sample, is that we interviewed up to 2 eligible workers per household in 2024. Previously, it's just been 1 person per household. So this enables us to get us an insight into household dynamics. Around 19% of the UK sample, that's both the online face-to-face components and the extended Northern Ireland survey, are in 2 interviewee households. So focusing on these interviewees, we can calculate the contribution each interviewee makes to household income to see whether that makes a difference to the access to home offices. Now, this is obviously a rough assessment, as we do not know about other eligible household members we didn't interview. Nevertheless, we can examine what difference relative pay levels within the household make to access to a home office. I'm earning more, have I got greater right to have a home office? Now, once the financial contribution individuals make to household income is taken into account, along with a host of other indicators using regression techniques, access to a home office is not associated with gender. It falls away. So this suggests that what matters is the financial contribution household members make to household income. Men on average contribute more than women, hence this graph. This money and power narrative is also supported by evidence which shows that the size of the home and the amount of time spent working at home are factors significantly associated with the creation of a home office, again using regression techniques. These differences are also evident in the descriptive data shown in this graph. These are descriptive. Looking at the shaded red bars, those living and working in detached houses, proxy for size, are over twice as likely as those living in a flat to use a home office when working at home. Similarly, looking at the blue shaded bars, we find that 60% of those who spend 4/5 or more of their time working at home use a dedicated office, dedicated home office, compared to 5% of those who work at home for less than the equivalent of 1 day out of 5. Summary and conclusion. The proportion working in a fixed place of work, such as an office, factory or shop, has fallen from 64% in 2001 to 38% in 2024. These workers tend to be in lower skilled occupations, where the move towards home working and hybrid working has been barely detectable. For them, working at home is not possible, not an option. However, those in higher skilled and higher paid occupations have seen a dramatic shift of work into the home, either working as home workers or as hybrid workers. For them, the fixed workplace, in this case the office, has become far less important as a place of work. To cope with the challenges of bringing work into the home, many workers separate the two by creating a home office. For these workers, the office is not dying, but is quite literally moving into the home. However, workers' ability to create an office within the home is dependent on the contribution individuals make to household income, the size of the dwelling, and the extent to which work is carried out at home. In short, I'm repeating in a way, those with more money and resources are firstly more likely to work at home, and secondly, those with more money and resources are better able to lay claim to a home office, which spatially separates them from the household when they do so. Policy, therefore, needs to continue to focus on promoting all forms of flexible working and not just working at home, which tends to favour the better off. I'll just end with a research perspective. From a research perspective, employment-focused surveys such as SES, I think I would argue, hope the team would agree, needs to collect more data on the household, since the home is an important source, since the home is an important workplace for many, and it's about which we know very little.
Thanks, Alan, and all of the other speakers. Fascinating. I've written lots of things down. Right, we're on to the questions, and I'm sure you've got lots stored up. So I won't exploit my position as chair to dominate the questions, but instead I'll turn it straight over because I think we've only got about 20 minutes or so to have questions. So does anyone have any questions and just let us know who you are and who the question is directed at if you have a person in mind. Gentleman over there.
Yes, Matic Badcup.
Do we have a, sorry to interrupt you, do we have a roving microphone? It'll pick it up. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Matic Badcup, I'm an independent researcher. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things that came out. Professor Ying Zhou, you mentioned that work was incredibly important in terms of happiness, and indeed, I suppose, health and happiness interrelating there. And I noticed from Professor Francis Green's work, when he was talking about quality of jobs, status and perception of status and job satisfaction was separated out. But I wonder whether, I don't know what people think about, whether the professions, for example, are as highly regarded as they were, and whether somebody in a job who thinks they're doing a worthwhile job believes that that is a higher quality of job as a result of its social worthwhileness. So that's a factor that I think would be very useful in the totality of the whole. And the other question I have, which is just for clarification, is Professor Green said that there's been a narrowing of medium real weekly earnings between men and women. But with regard to the previous evidence slide, it seems that the pay gap for full-time employees fell steadily from 17% to 10% in 2010, and then later just to 7% in 2024. I'm trying to understand the difference between those two slides. One's a natural, very gradual narrowing, and the other is a very, very significant narrowing. One's full-time employees and one's medium real wages. Are we talking about self-employment differences, or what's the relationship between those two slides?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Two detailed questions from someone who is paying very close attention. So, yes, over to the panelists.
Okay. I've answered the questions about the first one. Yes, I mentioned job quality has very large impact on our life satisfaction and general happiness. And you are right, job quality is also extremely important for feeling that you're doing something worthwhile. Actually, I gave a presentation at the first launch event looking at what determines meaningful work, and the intrinsic job quality dimensions really came up on top. For example, when people are able to use their skills, take initiative, and count on supportive managers, they are much more likely to see their work is meaningful. So actually, Francis also did a separate study looking at the nonlinear impact of job quality and well-being. An interesting finding from that study is the bottom decile actually is really worse off. If you are in the lowest 10% of the job quality distribution, your life satisfaction is far lower than the rest. So that's something we need to pay attention to going forward. I'll hand it to Francis for the second.
Yes, just then to answer your second question, it's true that the earnings gap curve didn't look so dramatic as that. I'd say that actually the earlier story wasn't that dramatic because it was over a long period of time, a quarter of a century. But the difference is that our curve here included the self-employed. And the self-employed earnings gap is horribly high, something like 40% in our data. I wouldn't completely trust that. It's not, when you're asking the self-employed to report their earnings in a survey, although we take time about it, we're not able to verify it from other sources, etc. But that's the basic difference. Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Any more questions from the room? Yes, at the back.
Jackie O'Reilly from the University of Sussex and the ESRC Centre for Digital Futures at Work. Thank you for another excellent seminar. But I have, it's not often you get to go to these kind of seminars, and there seems to be, on one hand, lots of reasons to be cheerful, especially in Rhys's presentation. And without wanting to sound like rain on the parade, it did remind me back in the 1980s, for those of us young and unemployed at the time, the band UB40 had a song called I Am the 1 in 10, which is I am the 10% of young unemployed people, which I was one myself. And at that time, that was considered pretty bad. So now we've got the 3 in 10 who are graduates in jobs that don't need a degree. That's 30% of young people who paid a lot of money to go to university from your survey. And so what a waste of money that was. I'm not getting paid for it, I'm not getting a proper job, and I am the 3 in 10 with a degree that nobody wants or will pay for. And I think that on one hand you said, oh, it's not so bad, 30%. Those 30%, when you meet them, I'm sure you've got lots of relatives or kids or stuff like that, they're having a really hard time getting in the labour market. Some of that is employers' expectations said we can't get the skills there because the demands of the skills they want have gone up so much. The array of digital skills they're meant to have is no longer just a bit of Excel, a bit of Word, it's Adobe, it's and this one as well, Mum, have you heard of that? No, I can do all that, not just basic, but proficiency. So there are lots of barriers to stop these young people getting into these kinds of jobs. Firms, that's the first point. So I think that 3 in 10 really, really matters. It's a number that is not, it's just not just a number, it's a person and lots of people behind it. And I think you should make more of that in some ways because it is a big issue. The second thing relates to the discussion Golo around adoption. Because I just put an aside to this. By the way, check out our art competition with better images of AI. It closed yesterday. It's really important that we don't have electric brains with white robots, men in suits and 15 chapel fingers in our images of what the future looks like. Anyway, that's an aside on the website. The question around adoption, what does adoption mean? So in the past, adoption tended to mean we buy a robot or a truck or something like that. The employers buy it and they decide either it will replace skills or we train our staff to use it. What does adoption mean now? Oh, this thing called Copilot's turned up in Microsoft. Don't know what it is. How do I use it? So you get 2 sets of staff, some who are out there in the Wild West pushing all the buttons and heaven knows what they're doing. Some who are scared to death about even touching it in case they break the machine. So I think adoption has really changed. It's no longer we buy a piece of tech and implement it like a robot, it has become integrated through the software machines, whether you want it or not. It's on your system, and what does it mean for the way work's organised? I think there are two questions: the 3 and 10, and what does adoption mean? Is that clear enough?
Thank you, Jackie. Excellent. Very good questions. Who wants to go first?
The UB40 song, amazing. I think what we should do with that track actually is go through the entire lyrics of it, because I'm a middle-aged businessman with chronic heart disease, etc. I live in a street which has no trees. It's amazing how little has changed from that song in the last 40 years. I would love to see the indicators for all of those things that UB40 song brought out with current national statistics, and see how little has changed across a variety of areas. I'd have to check the copyright for the song first, though. But I think it was a great video to put up. Now, yes, to go back to the more serious issue, yes, of course, that we have 35 people saying that they have they have a qualification, they have a degree, but that's not required for their job. Back in 1986, when people weren't paying tuition fees, were having maintenance grants, it was 30%. So, we need to consider that. It was heading in a worse direction. It did reach 4 in 10, didn't it? Like I said in that diagram back in the mid-2000s. It is coming down slightly, despite what's also important about this evidence is that there's contradictory evidence from an OECD survey, which has mentioned increasing rates of overqualification in the UK. And our survey makes an important contribution to that debate, because there are concerns about the consistency which the OECD survey is run. So, without being flippant, yes, it's still a significant cost on these students, but it's considering the increasing number of students who are coming into our labour markets. There is some evidence, at least, that those qualifications are being absorbed by the employers.
And on the second point, there's an excellent observation. AI, as you mentioned, is disembodied. It's not a machine that sits somewhere in the corner of an office. It's disembodied, basically driven, held on server somewhere across the world, and this very different way of adopting technology or bringing technology that is not necessarily in-house, but disembodied, sitting somewhere in a server run by an organization that is not yours, is obviously going to change the way how we should think about technology adoption, and how especially the productivity sharing is going to, the gains sharing is going to happen. Is it that these companies that provide these services, are they able to extract basically the price through the licensing agreements, and all the productivity gains from those, or is there anything left that can be shared with the workers that are actually then doing 25% more tasks, because they can automate some, can maybe write their emails a little bit faster.
Good, excellent. Oh, yeah, now the questions are appearing. Okay, super. Well, first we'll take this woman in blue.
Hi, Kate Simpson from the University of Nottingham. I've just got a question for Alan. Were there any generational age differences in your data about home working?
The short answer is no. The short answer is no. But again, on top of my head, that's my kind of inclination. There weren't any kind of differences in that right away. I thought people might ask about the presence of children, and there is, in terms of actually access to space. And in the descriptive data, there is a difference. So those with children are more likely to have greater difficulty creating a home office, for obvious reasons. Their rooms are being used for other purposes. But it falls out in the kind of multivariate analysis, so I didn't present it. I presented the gender descriptive because that's the one I think people would be most interested in. And also some other work from Finland, for example, descriptive data suggests a similar pattern with the gendering of it. I think what was interesting for me is delving into it in more detail, looking at the kind of household effect. It seems to be more to do with the household dynamic. And this is why I kind of ended my talk with a call for more, not a lot, but more questions on the household. because we know surprisingly little about the household, and the things that we know about the household have come by chance, if I might say it, not by design. So, for example, we interviewed 2 interviewees, if possible, per household. And so by chance, we've got an insight into the household. Also by chance, the issues about the dwelling, that was data collected by the interviewer on the doorstep. They actually looked at the house. Was it detached? What type of house it was? So again, that was kind of data we've never looked at before. Data collected on the doorstep, not collected online. So online, we know so little about the house. So I think that's the issue I'm interested in. We need to know a lot more about the household to understand what effect the household is having on access to space within the home for work purposes. Because going forward, it's here to stay. It's not going away, and we need to know more about it.
Thanks, Alan. My husband and I share a home office with his gym equipment and our washing machine and dryer. So equitable but chaotic. Who else has a question? Yes, the man right at the back.
Hi, Will Flannery from Wellbeing Research Centre in Oxford. It's mostly a question for Golo around the adoption, especially, and whether when you're looking at these survey responses, it's not so much that we're looking for, this percentage of usage going up and up and up, so it's 100%. Actually, more of the question we're picking up around who is using it. It's not so much that we're going to see 100% of rank and file using it, but significant proportion of senior managers using it, and this is where job cuts will come in. If you're a project manager, you don't need to hire an advertising agency or a translator, or if you're a researcher, you don't need a research assistant anymore because you teach from the data. So whether, it's a slightly different picture than just looking at usage coming up. And also, I know it's looking at the data we've got, but if it's kind of predict going forward, do you think the idea that the introduction of technology now is not getting a job cuts? Do you think that would hold up for data this year? A few provocations.
Great questions, thank you.
Excellent questions. Yeah, I'm not going to wait. Okay, speculating. I would say probably as soon as I think the context matters when we think about the economic context, the labor market context, business cycle matter when we think about how organizations use technology and its relationship to how that features in this spectrum from augmenting to replacement. With the data we've had and we've looked at in this configuration that we saw, there was a peak in this relationship between new technologies and workforce cuts in 2017, looking at this 5 years back. So over this kind of austerity period, we think maybe now with and the job market tightening could be there an argument for organizations maybe using technologies, especially for more often for making decisions not to hire someone new, that rely on, as you said, give a few examples of how AI might be used and avoiding hiring someone else. This is very much conceivable. Organizations now also had 2 years or a little bit more to think how these new technologies can have them save time and better understand where and how workforce savings could look like. So it is conceivable that we would now see a different picture emerge. The first one is yes, it will be interesting to see how these new technologies intersect with skills and where they're going to have this augmentation versus replacing them. There's already the emerging evidence suggests that this, specifically generative AI, is really good at bringing people up to speed, that it's especially people who are relatively low skilled in the roles that they are can catch up very fast. Does not mean that experience, for example, are going to be rewarded in the same way anymore, because it doesn't take you any longer half a year to train up a call center agent, but just a week. So this is some
And I think where we might see changes in how experience is valued. Maybe we will see a difference in the learning time requirements that happen. So it's fairly stubbornly stable over the years. Maybe this is going to come down certain AI experts jobs.
Great, yeah. I would just add that I think already we're starting to see some big technology companies, aren't we, coming out and saying that they're they're kind of reducing headcount, and this is associated with a big push on AI. And I think at the minute there's sort of a certain amount of skepticism about whether that's really the case, or whether, you know, it sends a different signal to your investors when you say we're laying people off because we're doing lots of snazzy, cool things with AI, versus we're laying people off because things aren't going very well. So I think at the minute there's a job of work to be done to disentangle some of that with some of the more recent announcements, particularly because there was so much post-pandemic hiring in those sectors. So I think some of that's probably just coming off the boil anyway. Super. Any more questions? Yes, lady here.
Jill Rubery, professor at Alliance Manchester Business School. I wanted to ask why nobody commented on the low increase in numerical skills. We're talking about a lot of focus on AI, and we hear all the time about how everybody has to do STEM subjects, and yet there's no trend there. That was one question. I just wanted to follow up on what Francis was saying about the gender pay gap, but also a general question. It seems to me that analysis you did on the gender job quality was more probably explained by compositional changes in the nature in the structure of jobs that women are doing by social class relative to what's happening in men's jobs by social class, and that actually the treatment of women within jobs is not necessarily changing that much. It's a problem of sort of interpreting that as the convergence, but it's not because gender discrimination has declined. It's more to do with structure. And I wondered I assume that you accounted for part-time workers in your weekly earnings? You said it was only self-employment, but presumably if you included part-time workers, that would explain that gap, unless you did a full-time equivalent.
Super, thank you very much.
On the numeracy skills first, yes, I forgot to mention actually, it's amazing how computer use has affected literacy skills in a large way, in the same way it might well have had a substitution effect on the numeracy skills. We need to dig in that question in more detail, because we have a suite of questions within the surveys, both in literacy skills and numeracy skills, and we try and dig out a better job there in digging out what's actually contributing to that lack of a rise in numeracy skills in recent years, and see if there is a relationship between the increased levels of computer use and that kind of petering off numeracy skills that we see.
I'm going to give the same sort of answer. Yeah, yes, you're probably right. We haven't had a chance to look into it yet. It's not meant to imply a fundamental change there. There are changes happening, as we know, but yeah, compositional changes. The only thing I did look at was in respect to the physical environment change, because we know that physical environment is strongly linked to industry that you work in, and that follows on from there. But the impact of compositional change on the gender gap, yeah, that's a whole new level of analysis which I haven't had time to do yet. You may be right, but I don't have any priors on it, to be honest.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up fairly soon. So shall we, is there anyone who still has a burning question? Oh, okay, why don't we take those two burning questions together? And after that, we'll move. Yes, you first.
Sure, I go first. I'm Stephen Overall. I work in research for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Looking across all your findings and all the presentations, one of the messages that seems to come out, at least to me, is it's a little bit more reassuring, perhaps optimistic and comforting than other findings in fields about job quality, fields about skills, and to do with the adoption of technology. Why do you think that might be? I'm inviting you to speculate and give your thoughts about why it appears to present a little bit more of a reassuring picture from the Skills and Employment Survey than other research in these kinds of fields.
Good question. Hang on, we're just going to take the other question and then you can answer whichever ones you want. Yep.
Hi, I'm Lola from project at the Oxford Internet Institute. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the skills as well. So you obviously demonstrated that generic skills are on the rise. What about critical thinking skills? Did you look into this? Because obviously we're talking about Gen AI, basically outsourcing knowledge work. I'm just wondering if this was something you explored and whether the picture was a little bit different.
Two excellent questions. Go for it.
I'm just trying to tackle your first interesting big question. Yes, it is a surprisingly unpessimistic, at least, story from the survey. And I think some of that has got to do with the disruptions which were caused by the pandemic lockdowns and the subsequent recalibration of work organisation in the home for at least some part of the workforce, or at least that ongoing trend, as Alan pointed out. Yeah, it is optimistic. Why is it different from other surveys? Well, it is different in some respect. We'd have to analyse that in greater detail. But one of the things we could claim about this survey, it is nationally representative. This is a nationally representative survey with all its problems, its response rate issues, and so on and so forth. But we do our very, very best to make sure that we're looking at a representative sample of the population. And it's very easy to pick out stories of decline. It's much easier to write a bad news story in academic life as it is in journalistic life. And I've written enough bad news stories myself over the years. But to be honest, this is not such a bad news story. I mean, I've rabbited on about work intensification now for 20 years myself, and yet actually we're in a period of de-intensification, at least over the last 5-6 years. And I think if anything, it demonstrates the value of large-scale representative data.
Can I also comment on that? I mean, it's interesting you say that, Steve, because I think we've got a mixed picture. I think there are some good news stories, and I think there's some definitely good news stories that you identify. Then there's some stories that I think are mixed. Depends on your politics, for example. The rising influence of trade unions in the workplace. That depends on your politics. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I mean, then take the pick. And that very much depends on your politics. And then I think there are some bad news stories as well. Workplace abuse. We haven't got a trend, but workplace abuse is pretty large scale. 14%, I think it was 1 in 8. That's a significant bad news story, and it gets worse than that. The bad news story, and the bad news story affects disproportionately those who are most vulnerable in the labour market as well. So it gets worse. So I'm not sure it's wholly good news. It depends which report you pick up. And there are 8 of them. I urge you to read them all. Yeah, I'm going to test you later. But I do think we've got. I think that's the strength, echoing what Francis was saying about the skills and employment survey. There's good reports you've got, and we've scratched the surface. I mean, we really have. And as Ying said at the beginning, this, and also Alison Park made the point, it's an ESRC supported project. The data will be in the archive in 2026, so you don't have to wait too long to get your hands on it. And it's as Ying said, it's a gold mine for others to look at. So I think generally the 8 reports, I would say, are a mixture, and depending on your politics and inclination, you might think it's a good news or bad news story.
Great. And how about the question on critical thinking? And
yeah, so we don't have a measure of particular on critical thinking amongst the 40 measures on skills that we include in the survey. But there might be some in there which kind of allude to it more closely than others. Of interesting one. The problem solving, yeah, I suppose that could be one. What we could, and just on the mixture of is it a good news or bad news story, on the skills, I think the survey was conducted during a time which is at the back end of an historically tight labour market. So there's often quite good news stories for the skills in the context of a labour market which is very tight. So employers are responding to that, perhaps by having to train their own, But of course, why is the labour market tight? Well, we have high levels of economic inactivity and withdrawal from participation in the labour market. So that in itself just demonstrates the complexities of how what looks like a good news story on the skills front, the causes of it could be far from good.
Wonderful. Right. Well, on that mixed note, we're going to talk to. I'm so sorry, but I think we have to.
No. There are people on the line. You check online for questions.
Oh, unfortunately, the way it's set up today is the people online aren't able to ask questions. They just have to watch. Sorry about that, online people. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and yeah, thank you to all of the panelists and the sponsors. I mean, I think my big takeaway is, this survey I think captured the British labour market at a moment where huge change was just appearing. As you said, it's a historically tight labour market, and you could see in that survey on AI how quickly something really big and different was starting to happen. So all of which to say, I can't wait to read the findings of the next one.